November 17th, 1847. The morning sun rose over Cypress Grove Plantation in Mississippi Delta, but it brought no warmth, only revelation. 13 women stood in the front garden, lined up like soldiers, all pregnant. Some 7 months along, some 9, but their bellies had all been cut open in identical vertical slashes. The babies had been removed, placed on the ground beside them, still connected by umbilical cords. And the women? They were alive, conscious, their eyes wide and aware, but they couldn't scream, because their tongues had been cut out. Plantation owner Edward Harlow sat on the front steps of his manor house. His eyes had been gouged from their sockets, his hands had been severed at the wrists, but he was still breathing, still moving his head slowly from side to side, as if searching for something he could no longer see. Standing in the centre of it all was Tobias, a slave, 32 years old, in his hand a blood-soaked knife, on his face an expression that witnesses would later describe as not anger, not madness, but something far more terrifying, peace. When the townspeople arrived, 40 men and women, what they saw made 12 of them vomit on the spot. 14 fainted. Reverend Joshua Matthews, a man who had presided over funerals for 20 years, fell to his knees and wept like a child. But no one could touch Tobias, because 7 of those 13 women, bleeding and mutilated as they were, formed a protective circle around him. When Sheriff Thomas McKinley drew his pistol, Margaret Harlow, the plantation owner's wife, stepped forward. Her belly opened, her child lying dead at her feet, and she raised her bloodied hands in front of Tobias. "You'll have to kill us first," she said through the gap where her tongue had been, the words garbled but unmistakable. How does a man reach this point? How does a slave become something that makes even his victims defend him? Before we uncover the disturbing truth that would shake Mississippi society to its core, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment below what state you're watching from. Because this story isn't just about one man's revenge, it's about what happens when justice and vengeance become indistinguishable. Now let me take you back to where it all truly began. Spring 1828, Natchez, Mississippi. This was a world of rigid lines, white and black, free and enslaved, wealthy and poor. But there were exceptions, small ones, carefully guarded. The Turner family was one such exception. Naomi Turner, 32 years old, had been born free in Philadelphia. Her parents had been freed slaves who'd worked their way north, built a small bakery, saved every penny. Naomi grew up literate, educated in a Quaker school, understanding the world in ways most black people in America never could. When her parents died of fever in 1815, she inherited their savings. Not much by white standards, a fortune by any other measure. She moved south in 1816, seeking warmer weather and cheaper land. It was a dangerous decision. Free black people in the South lived in constant peril, their papers scrutinized, their movements restricted. But Naomi was clever. She bought a small farm outside Natchez, paid in full with witness documentation. She registered her status as a free person with the county clerk, paid a white lawyer to file the papers in triplicate, kept copies in 3 separate locations. In 1818, she married Joseph Turner, another free black man, a carpenter whose skills made him valuable enough that white society tolerated his existence. Their daughter Ruth was born in 1820, their son Tobias in 1823. For a brief moment in American history, this small family existed in a fragile bubble of semi-normalcy. Joseph built furniture for white families who paid well and didn't ask questions. Naomi grew vegetables and herbs, selling them at the colored market. Ruth learned to read from her mother's books. Young Tobias showed unusual aptitude with numbers, able to calculate prices and measurements in his head faster than most adults. They were not safe. They would never be safe. But they were alive and together and free, which was more than millions of others could say. Then came August 5th, 1828. Joseph Turner had died 3 months earlier. A construction accident. A wealthy client's mansion, a beam that wasn't properly secured. Joseph was crushed. The client paid for the funeral but offered no additional compensation. Naomi and her children now stood alone. Edward Harlow had been watching. Harlow was 28 years old in 1828. He had inherited Cypress Grove Plantation when his father died in 1825, along with considerable debts. The property was modest by Delta standards. 800 acres, 42 slaves. Enough to be comfortable, but not enough to be powerful. Harlow wanted power more than he wanted breath. He was a thin man, perpetually nervous, with pale skin that burned easily in the Mississippi sun. His eyes were a watery blue, set too close together. People who met him often commented that he seemed like he was always calculating something, always measuring the world in terms of what could be gained or lost. And he had learned something valuable from his father. The law existed to serve those who understood how to manipulate it. On the evening of August 5th, Harlow rode to the Turner farm with 3 men. Not his regular overseers. These were professionals, men who specialized in capturing runaways and recovering supposedly stolen property. Men who asked no questions when white men pointed at black people and said, "Mine." Naomi was inside preparing dinner. Ruth, now 8 years old, was reading by the window. Tobias, 5 years old, was playing with wooden blocks his father had made. The knock came at sunset. Naomi knew immediately. Something in the sound of it, the authority, the presumption. She looked at her children and in that moment made a decision. She walked to the bedroom, pulled out her freedom papers and held them in her hand as she opened the door. "Good evening," Edward Harlow said, smiling. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you." "What can I do for you, sir?" Naomi's voice was careful, neutral, not friendly, but not hostile. The exact tone required of black people addressing whites. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding," Harlow said. He gestured to the men behind him. "These gentlemen have informed me that you and your children are runaway slaves, property of the deceased Samuel Winters of Louisiana. I've come to verify the claim." Naomi's hand tightened on her papers. "I am a free woman, sir. Born free. My children were born free. I have documentation. May I see it?" This was the trap. The beautiful, perfect trap. Because if Naomi refused to show her papers, she appeared to be hiding something. But if she handed them over, they left her possession. She handed them over. Harlow made a show of examining them. He held them up to the fading light. He read carefully. Then he frowned. "These appear to be forgeries," he said. "They are not forgeries, sir. They were filed with—" "These," Harlow interrupted, his voice rising slightly, "are forgeries. Poorly made ones. I'm afraid you'll need to come with us until this matter can be sorted out properly." "You cannot do this." Naomi's voice remained level, but Tobias, watching from inside, saw his mother's hand begin to shake. "Those papers are legal and registered. I have a lawyer in town who can verify." "Your supposed lawyer," Harlow said, "died last month. Unfortunate gambling debts, shot himself. Very sad." This was true. Naomi had learned of it only days before and hadn't yet found a replacement. Another piece of Harlow's timing. The county clerk then, the records. "There was a fire at the clerk's office last week. Terrible tragedy. Many documents were lost, including, I'm afraid, yours." Also true. Also perfectly timed. Naomi understood then. This was planned. Methodical. She looked past Harlow to his men. They had chains ready. "My children," she said quietly, "will come with you, of course. Can't separate a family." Harlow smiled again. "I'm not a monster, Naomi. May I call you Naomi? I simply need to sort this out properly. Once we verify your status, you'll be free to go." Lies, every word. But what could she do? If she ran, they would chase her. If she fought, they would overpower her. If she screamed, who would come? There were no neighbours close enough to hear. "May I at least gather some belongings?" "Of course. Take your time." Naomi went inside. She moved to the kitchen where Tobias and Ruth watched with wide, frightened eyes. She knelt before them, speaking quickly and quietly. "Listen to me carefully. No matter what happens, you remember this. You were born free. Your grandmother and grandfather were freed slaves who worked for their liberty. Your father was a free man. I am a free woman. You are free. Do you understand?" Ruth nodded, crying silently. Tobias, only 5, didn't fully comprehend, but he nodded too. "Remember your name, Tobias Turner. Remember your birthday. Remember everything I've taught you. And one day, when you're old enough, you find a way back. You hear me? You find a way back." She held them for one moment. Just one. Then she stood, gathered a small bag of clothes and walked back outside. They put chains on her wrists that night. Chains on 8-year-old Ruth's wrists. And they made 5-year-old Tobias walk between them, small hands gripping his mother's skirt, as they led the family to Cypress Grove Plantation. What happened over the next 3 days would define the remaining 19 years of Tobias's life. But what happened in those 3 days that could turn a 5-year-old child into the man who would, 19 years later, perform one of the most horrific acts of revenge in Mississippi history? To understand, you need to know what Edward Harlow truly was beneath his thin veneer of civilization. Because what he did to Naomi and Ruth wasn't just cruelty. It was systematic destruction, and young Tobias witnessed all of it. Cypress Grove Plantation had a building called the Seasoning House. Most plantations in the Deep South had one, a place where newly acquired slaves were broken in to their new reality. Located far from the main house, away from prying eyes, a simple wooden structure with no windows and one heavy door. The building sat at the edge of the property, surrounded by dense cypress trees that made the area perpetually dark even at midday. Spanish moss hung from branches like grey fingers reaching toward the earth. The air there felt different, heavier, as if the ground itself remembered every scream that had soaked into it over the years. The structure was approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, rough-hewn wood walls, no insulation, dirt floor packed hard by countless feet. During summer it became an oven. During winter, a freezer. This wasn't accidental. Extreme discomfort was part of the process. Break the body, break the spirit. Inside there were no furnishings except chains mounted to the walls at various heights. Some for wrists, some for ankles, some for necks. The variety allowed for different forms of restraint depending on the overseer's preference and the perceived severity of the slave's attitude problem. Edward Harlow put Naomi and Ruth in the seasoning house on the night of August 5th. He put Tobias in a small adjacent room, separated by a wall thin enough to hear everything. This was intentional. The adjacent room had been added specifically for this purpose. When Harlow had inherited the plantation from his father in 1825, one of his first acts was to renovate the seasoning house. He'd instructed the construction slaves to build the small room with walls deliberately thin, not so thin that you could see through, but thin enough that sound travelled perfectly. Sometimes, his father had told him, breaking a slave isn't about what you do to them, it's about what you make them witness. A man who watches his family suffer will break faster and more completely than one who suffers alone. But here's the key. You don't actually have to do as much damage. The imagination fills in the gaps. The sounds are enough. Harlow had remembered this lesson, applied it meticulously. Tobias's room was 6 feet by 8 feet, no window, one small oil lamp that Harlow controlled from outside, a bucket in the corner for waste, nothing else, not even a blanket, just 4 walls and a dirt floor and the sounds coming through the wall. Day 1 began at dawn. Harlow entered the seasoning house with 2 of his overseers. Tobias, pressed against the thin wall, heard his mother's voice first. "Please, whatever you want from us, I'll give it. Work, money, anything. Just let my children go." "Money?" Harlow's voice was curious, almost gentle. What money would a slave have? "I'm not a slave. You know I'm not. This is kidnapping. This is sound of a slap. Hard. Then silence. "Let me explain something to you, Naomi," Harlow said. His voice remained calm, conversational. "You see, I have a problem. I need more workers, but I'm short on capital to purchase them properly. So I've developed an alternative approach. Free blacks with insufficient documentation. It's remarkably easy, actually. The law presumes slavery. One simply has to destroy the proof of freedom, which I've done. Your papers? Your lawyer? Dead. The county records? Gone. And your farm? I've already filed a claim. By month's end, it will be mine. Someone will come looking. Who? You have no family. Your church knows you as a quiet woman who kept to herself. Your neighbours are 2 miles away and barely know your name. You are essentially invisible, which makes this so much easier." Tobias heard struggling, his mother's voice raised in protest, then Ruth crying out, then sounds that the 5-year-old boy couldn't fully comprehend, but knew instinctively were terrible. Harlow wanted Tobias to hear. That was the point. Break the mother, traumatize the children, create people so psychologically damaged that they wouldn't even think of resistance. It worked on Ruth. The 8-year-old girl broke completely by day 2. She stopped speaking, stopped responding. Her eyes went distant and empty. It didn't work on Tobias. Something different happened to him. On the evening of day 2, Harlow came to the small room where Tobias had been kept. The boy hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, had listened to his mother's screams and his sister's sobs for 36 hours straight. Harlow crouched down, bringing his face level with the child's. "Do you understand what's happening, boy?" Tobias said nothing, but he looked directly into Harlow's eyes. Not down, as enslaved people were taught, not away, directly at him. "Your mother was a slave. Your father was a slave. You are a slave. You were all born slaves. That is the truth now, the only truth that matters. Do you understand?" Tobias's voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "My name is Tobias Turner. I was born free on March 12, 1823. My mother is Naomi Turner. My father was Joseph Turner. My sister is Ruth Turner. We are free." Harlow smiled. "No, you're not." Then he did something that haunted Tobias more than anything else. He pulled out a piece of paper, a bill of sale, pre-printed with blanks filled in with fresh ink. "This says I purchased you, your mother and your sister from Samuel Winters of New Orleans 3 days ago. Paid $400. It's signed, witnessed, and will be filed tomorrow. This is a legal document. Your freedom papers, they don't exist. So tell me, boy, which is real? The paper that says you're free, which no longer exists, or this paper which does?" Tobias understood then, at 5 years old, something profound about how the world worked. Truth didn't matter. Power did. The person who controlled the paper controlled reality. But Harlow made one mistake. One critical miscalculation. He let Tobias see his face. Really see it. The satisfaction in his eyes, the slight smile, the pleasure he took in this moment. Most slaveholders hid behind necessity, economics, the supposed natural order. They told themselves stories about kindness and responsibility. Harlow wasn't hiding. He enjoyed it, and Tobias memorized that face, every feature, every expression. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the pattern of lines around his mouth. On day 3, Naomi and Ruth were assigned to the plantation's field labor. Tobias, being small, was assigned to the main house as a domestic servant, a cruel separation designed to prevent the family from comforting each other. That night, Naomi managed to find Tobias for just 60 seconds while carrying water to the main house. She knelt before him, her face bruised, her eyes hollow, but her voice fierce. "Remember what I told you. You were born free. Whatever he says, whatever he makes you do, you remember that truth. Hold it inside. Never let it go. One day you'll need it." "Mama, I'm going to..." Tobias didn't have words for what he was going to do. He was 5, but the intention was there, wordless and absolute. "I know, baby. I know, but not now. You survive, you hear me? You survive, and you wait. One day, he'll give you an opportunity. And when he does, you take it." That was the last real conversation Tobias had with his mother. 2 months later, Naomi died. The official record said fever. The reality was exhaustion, infection from untreated wounds, and a complete loss of the will to live. Ruth lasted 8 more months. She never spoke again, never truly saw anything again. She simply existed until her body gave out. Tobias survived, and he remembered every single day of those 3 days, every sound, every word, every moment. And he waited. But how does a child survive such trauma and not just break completely like his sister? How does that grief and rage not destroy him from the inside? The answer lies in what Tobias did in the years that followed. Because he didn't just survive, he studied, he planned, and he became something far more dangerous than an angry man. He became a patient one. From 1828 to 1843, Tobias did something unusual for an enslaved person. He made himself useful, indispensable, not through physical strength, though he developed that too, through intelligence. Working in the main house, he learned to read by watching Harlow's children study. He memorized letters, sounded out words in his head, practiced when no one was watching. By age 10, he could read as well as most white adults. By 12, better than most. He learned mathematics by watching the plantation's bookkeeper. Cotton yields, profit margins, compound interest. He understood Cypress Grove's finances better than Harlow himself did. He learned people, how to read expressions, what small gestures meant, who could be manipulated and how, who was dangerous and should be avoided. Most importantly, he learned Edward Harlow. Harlow was vain. He needed validation constantly. He would talk to anyone who listened about his business acumen, his plans for expansion, his certainty that he deserved more wealth and status than he currently possessed. Tobias listened, quietly, attentively. And over 15 years, he built a complete psychological profile of the man who had destroyed his family. Harlow was insecure about his status among wealthy planters. He was obsessed with bloodlines and legitimacy. He believed deeply in the importance of pure white lineage and saw his family line as something sacred. His greatest pride was his ancestry. His greatest fear was being seen as inferior to the Delta's elite families. This was the weakness. This was the crack in the armour. In 1843, Harlow faced a crisis, crop failures from 2 bad seasons, significant debts, and pressure from wealthier neighbours who saw him as a pretender to status he hadn't earned. He needed capital, fast. But he was too proud to ask for loans from men he considered his social equals. So he came up with an alternative plan. Breeding. Enslaved people were valuable. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically slaves themselves, regardless of the father's status. If Harlow could increase his slave population through births rather than purchases, he could solve his financial problems without the humiliation of borrowing money. He needed someone to serve as a breeding slave. Someone physically strong, intelligent enough to be selective about which women to approach, and trustworthy enough not to cause problems. He chose Tobias. It was April 1843. Tobias was 20 years old, tall and powerfully built from years of physical labour. He had never caused trouble, never attempted escape, never showed anything but quiet obedience. Harlow called him into the study one evening. "I have a proposition for you, Tobias." "Yes, sir." "I need you to take on a special role. I want you to breed with the young women in the quarters, produce children, strong ones. I'll provide you with better quarters, better food, and certain privileges. In exchange, you do this work diligently and discreetly. Do you understand?" Tobias looked at him, really looked at him, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, something colder. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Good. You'll start with the 6 unmarried women between ages 18 and 25. I expect results within 18 months. "Yes, sir. And the women, sir? They've agreed to this?" Harlow waved his hand dismissively. "They'll do as they're told. It's not complicated." "Of course, sir." Tobias left that meeting and went to his quarters. He sat on his bed in the darkness, and he smiled for the first time in 15 years, because Edward Harlow had just handed him the weapon he needed, not the breeding itself. Harlow expected Tobias to stay within the enslaved population. That was the plan. That was what made it profitable. But Harlow had given Tobias something far more valuable: freedom of movement, reduced supervision, and access to the main house at unusual hours. Over the next 4 years, Tobias would use those privileges to destroy everything Edward Harlow valued. So how did Tobias go from being assigned to breed slave women to ending up with 13 pregnant women, 7 of them white, including Harlow's own wife and daughter? This is where his plan became truly diabolical, because he didn't force anyone. He didn't need to. What he did was far more sophisticated. He studied each woman's weakness and gave them exactly what they needed most, and in doing so he made them complicit in their own destruction. Tobias's plan unfolded in stages, each woman carefully selected and approached differently based on her vulnerabilities. He didn't see this as seduction, he saw it as war by other means. Woman 1. Sarah, age 22, house slave. Sarah was first because she was easiest. She was lonely, isolated from other slaves because of her house position, and desperate for any kindness. Tobias approached her with simple gentleness. Conversations, shared moments. Within 2 months she trusted him completely. Within 4 she was pregnant. This was Harlow's intention, so Sarah's pregnancy raised no immediate suspicion. Woman 2. Rebecca, age 24, field slave. Rebecca was angry. She'd been separated from her husband when Harlow sold him to pay debts. She hated everyone. Tobias gave her a target for that anger. He talked to her about Harlow's weaknesses, his financial problems, his fears. He made her feel powerful by sharing information. Their connection was based on shared rage. When she became pregnant, she saw it as a small revenge, forcing Harlow to raise another mouth to feed. Women 3 through 6, field and house slaves, ages 19 to 26. Tobias approached each differently, but the pattern was similar. So he offered them something no one else did: attention, respect, the feeling of being seen as human. These 4 pregnancies were all within Harlow's expectations. 6 pregnant slave women in 18 months. Harlow was pleased. Then Tobias's real plan began. Woman 7. Margaret Harlow, age 42, plantation owner's wife. Margaret Eleanor Weston had been 19 years old when she married Edward Harlow in 1825. It was a business arrangement, like most marriages in their social class. Her father owned significant land in Louisiana. Edward's father needed political connections. The marriage served both families' interests. What Margaret wanted had never been part of the discussion. She'd been educated, unusual for the time. Her mother had been progressive, believing daughters should be literate and knowledgeable. Margaret could read Latin, speak French, and had opinions about philosophy and politics that she'd learned to keep hidden because no one wanted to hear them. Edward had seemed acceptable enough at 19. He was 24, reasonably handsome, from a good family. Margaret had imagined they might build something together. Partnership, perhaps even affection. By 1844, 23 years later, Margaret understood how naive she'd been. Edward had never wanted a partner. He'd wanted an ornament, a womb to produce heirs, a hostess to maintain his social standing. In private, he barely acknowledged her existence. In public, he spoke to her in clipped, condescending tones that made clear she was property, not person. They'd had no children. Margaret didn't know if the failure was hers or his, but Edward blamed her completely. Barren was the word he used, often and cruelly. He'd never hit her. That would leave marks people might see, but his words cut deeper than fists ever could. By 1844, Margaret had learned to live in a kind of waking sleep. She performed her duties, managed the household, attended social functions, smiled when required, but inside she was slowly dying. Every day a little more of herself erased until she barely remembered who she'd been before Edward. The evening Tobias first encountered her in the garden, she was crying because she'd just turned 42, 23 years married. No children, no love, no purpose, just an endless grey expanse of years stretch ahead with no hope of change. In her society, a woman past 40 with no children was worse than useless. She was invisible. Tobias had been carrying firewood from the storage shed to the main house. He'd taken a shortcut through the garden, which wasn't technically allowed, but which he did regularly, because the overseers were lazy and didn't patrol thoroughly after dark. He heard crying before he saw her, soft, muffled sobs coming from behind the rose bushes. He could have walked past. Should have. Slaves who inserted themselves into white people's private moments rarely benefited. But something about the sound stopped him, not the sadness. He heard sadness constantly, but the restraint in it. This was someone who'd spent years learning to cry silently, to mourn without being heard. He recognized that kind of grief. Tobias set down the firewood carefully, quietly. He stepped around the rose bushes. Margaret sat on a stone bench, her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with the effort of staying silent. "Mrs. Harlow? Are you well?" She startled violently, jerking her head up. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy. She wiped at her cheeks frantically, trying to compose herself. "I'm fine. Go about your business." The proper response would have been immediate obedience. "Yes, ma'am. Of course, ma'am." But Tobias had spent 16 years studying people, reading their bodies, their voices, the things they didn't say, and what he saw in Margaret's face wasn't anger at being discovered. It was desperation for someone, anyone, to see her. "Forgive me, ma'am," he said quietly, making no move to leave, "but you don't look fine." Margaret opened her mouth to order him away. The words were right there. "You can't speak to me like that. Remember your place. Leave immediately." But they wouldn't come. Because Tobias wasn't looking at her the way everyone else did. Not with the servant's careful blankness. Not with Edward's dismissive contempt. Not with the social set's false sympathy that barely masked their glee at her childlessness. He was looking at her like she was a person. Like her pain mattered. Like he genuinely wanted to know if she was all right. When was the last time someone had asked her that and meant it? Years? Ever. "You can't speak to me like—" She started the sentence but couldn't finish it, because suddenly all the proper words, all the social scripts, felt impossibly heavy. She was so tired, so unbearably tired. "I know I can't, ma'am," Tobias said. His voice was gentle, but there was something else in it. Understanding. "But sometimes rules matter less than kindness, and you look like you could use some kindness." Margaret stared at him. This was dangerous. For both of them. If anyone saw them talking like this, saw her crying in front of a slave, saw him speaking to her with such familiarity, the consequences would be severe. But she was 42 years old. She'd spent 23 years following every rule, being perfect, being invisible, being what everyone needed her to be. And where had it gotten her? "I turned 42 today," she whispered, not sure why she was saying it. Not sure why she trusted this man she barely knew. 23 years married, no children, no purpose, no point to any of it. Tobias didn't offer platitudes, didn't say things would get better or that she should be grateful for what she had. Instead, he said something that cut through all her careful defences. "You've disappeared, haven't you? Not died, just faded until there's almost nothing left." Margaret made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Yes, exactly that. How did you—" "I know what it looks like when someone stops existing while their body's still working," Tobias said. "I've seen it. I've felt it. That slow erasure until you're just going through motions and can't remember why." He was talking about slavery, she realised. But he was also talking about marriage. About her marriage specifically. And the fact that he'd drawn that parallel, that he saw her imprisonment as real, even though she lived in luxury, made something crack open inside her chest. They talked for 20 minutes that night. Not about anything significant. Just small things. Books she'd read. Places she wished she could see. Thoughts she'd had but never spoken. And Tobias listened. Really listened. Asked questions. Responded with insights that proved he was educated far beyond what any slave was supposed to be. When she finally stood to leave, she said, "Thank you for seeing me. No one has in a very long time." "You're not invisible, Mrs. Harlow," Tobias said. "You're just surrounded by blind people." Margaret went to bed that night and thought about that conversation for hours. It was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. But God help her, it was also the most alive she'd felt in years. Over the next 3 months, they had 7 more accidental encounters. Always in private, always brief. Tobias never overstepped. He simply listened, let her talk, acknowledged her feelings. The 8th encounter, she kissed him. The 9th encounter, she invited him to her private quarters. Margaret wasn't stupid. She knew the danger, but she was 42 years old, trapped in a miserable marriage, living in a society that gave her no options. Tobias represented something impossible. Choice, agency, desire. Their affair lasted 6 months before she realized she was pregnant. She panicked initially, but Tobias calmed her. "Tell him it's his. He'll believe it. He wants to believe it. His ego needs it to be true." And Tobias was right. When Margaret told Edward she was pregnant after years of trying, he was ecstatic. His bloodline would continue. His legacy was secure. Woman 8, Virginia Harlow, age 19, plantation owner's daughter. Virginia was young, naive, and desperately curious about life beyond the plantation. She read romantic novels in secret and dreamed of adventures she'd never have. Her father had already arranged her marriage to the son of another planter, a man she'd met twice and found insufferably boring. Tobias met her in the library where he sometimes brought firewood. She was reading. He noticed the book, a forbidden novel about a woman who defied society's expectations. "That's a good one," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. Slaves weren't supposed to read. "You've read this?" "Yes, miss. Several times. That was the beginning. They talked about books, then about ideas, philosophy, freedom, what it meant to choose your own path." For Virginia, Tobias represented everything her society said was impossible, an intelligent, educated black man who saw her as more than her father's property. Their relationship developed over 8 months. By the time it became physical, Virginia believed herself to be in love. When she became pregnant, she panicked, but Tobias had a plan. "Tell your father you were raped by one of the field hands. He'll believe it, and he'll never question which one because you'll be too traumatized to identify him." Virginia was horrified by the lie, but saw no alternative. When she told her father, Edward exploded with rage, beat 3 random field slaves, and locked Virginia in her room for her own protection. He believed her completely because the alternative, that his daughter had willingly laid with a black man, was unthinkable. Women 9 through 13, the town women. These were the most dangerous. These were the women who would complete Tobias's revenge. Elizabeth Thornton, age 35, doctor's wife, lonely, married to a man who ignored her. Rebecca Hayes, age 26, reverend's wife, desperate to escape her prison of false piety. Caroline Murphy, age 28, schoolteacher, intelligent and suffocated by small-town expectations. Abigail Dixon, age 24, merchant's wife, trapped in an abusive marriage. Sarah Brenner, age 30, lawyer's wife, nursing a secret opium addiction. Tobias met each of them through his increased access to town. Harlow occasionally sent him on errands, trusting him because of his good behaviour. Tobias used these opportunities brilliantly. With Elizabeth, he played the role of confidant. She could talk to him without judgment. With Rebecca, he presented himself as morally superior to her hypocritical husband. With Caroline, he engaged her intellectually in ways no one else did. With Abigail, he offered protection and gentleness. With Sarah, he provided the comfort she couldn't find anywhere else. Each woman fell for different reasons, but the pattern was the same. Tobias gave them something their society and their marriages had denied them. Recognition. Respect. The feeling of being truly seen. By fall 1846, all 5 were pregnant, and Tobias's trap was set. But here's what none of these women knew. None of them. Tobias wasn't building relationships, he was building evidence. Because every encounter, every conversation, every intimate moment, he was documenting it. Not in writing, not yet. In his memory. Every detail, every word, every vulnerability he'd exploited. Because when the moment came, when everything unravelled, Tobias needed these women to understand exactly what he'd done, and more importantly, why. By January 1847, the timeline was perfect. All 13 women were in various stages of pregnancy. The 6 slave women first, then Margaret Harlow, then Virginia, then the 5 town women staggered over several months. Edward Harlow noticed nothing. The slave pregnancies were expected. His wife's pregnancy filled him with pride. His daughter's traumatic assault made him protective and violent toward his slaves, but he never questioned the story. And the town women? He had no reason to connect them to anything happening at Cypress Grove. But the universe has a way of unravelling even the most carefully constructed lies. The first crack appeared in March 1847. Sarah Brenner gave birth early. 7 months pregnant, she'd gone into labour suddenly during a church service. The baby came fast, there in the church basement, attended by 3 other women who'd been at the service. The child was healthy, strong lungs, good weight for being early, and clearly, unmistakably, mixed race. The baby had dark skin that would only darken as she aged, tightly curled black hair, and features that spoke of African ancestry. Sarah's husband, prominent lawyer James Brenner, was a pale redhead with freckles across every inch of exposed skin. His family had been Scottish, arrived in America 3 generations back, and had the kind of fair colouring that burned in 5 minutes of southern sun. There was no possible way this child was his. The women who'd attended the birth looked at each other in silent, horrified understanding. They wrapped the baby quickly, helped Sarah to a private room, and then one of them, Martha Whitfield, the merchant's wife, went to find James. He was in the main sanctuary, listening to Reverend Hayes conclude his sermon about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of wifely obedience. The irony of that timing would haunt him later. Martha whispered in his ear, "Your wife has delivered. You should come now." James stood, excitement clear on his face. He'd wanted a child for years. He practically ran to the basement. When he saw the baby, his face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, comprehension, rage, all in about 10 seconds. He looked at Sarah. She was pale, exhausted, tears streaming down her face. She knew. Of course she knew. She'd known for months what this moment would be like. "James, I can explain." "Explain?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried all the fury of a scream. "Explain how my child is a nigger." The word hung in the air like poison. The women attending Sarah flinched. Sarah closed her eyes. "It's not what you think." "What I think." James's voice was rising now. "What I think is that my wife is a whore. What I think is that I've been made a fool. What I think is that every man in this county is going to know that James Brenner couldn't satisfy his own wife, so she went and fucked a slave." "James, please." "Who?" His hands were shaking. Who was it?" Sarah hesitated, because saying the name out loud made it real, made it something that couldn't be taken back, but what choice did she have? The evidence was there in her arms, alive and crying. A slave, from Cypress Grove. His name is Tobias. James stood completely still for a long moment. Then he turned and left the room without another word. What he did next would set off a chain reaction that would destroy multiple families before the month was out. James was a lawyer. He understood discretion. He understood that some problems couldn't be solved through legal channels or public confrontation. So he did what men in his position did. He reached out to other husbands quietly, carefully, feeling out who might be having similar issues. It took him less than 2 weeks to identify 4 other men whose wives were pregnant under suspicious circumstances. Dr. William Thornton. His wife Elizabeth had been pregnant for 6 months but had been acting strangely, distant, guilty. Thornton had assumed she was nervous about childbirth, their first, but now he wondered if there was another reason. Reverend Joshua Hayes. His wife Rebecca had announced her pregnancy 4 months ago with a kind of defiance that had puzzled him at the time. Rebecca had always been dutiful, proper, exactly what a minister's wife should be, but lately she'd been different, harder, less concerned with propriety. Merchant Thomas Dixon. His wife Abigail was 8 months along and had been avoiding him for weeks. When he'd asked why, she'd claimed exhaustion, but her eyes had told a different story. Guilt. Fear. Something unspoken. And there was one more. Someone who'd heard about the situation through James and had come forward with information of his own. Schoolteacher Caroline Murphy's landlord. He'd noticed her condition, but also noticed something else. She'd been receiving visitors. Late at night. A man who didn't look like her husband. A man whose silhouette in the window had looked distinctly like a Negro. The 5 men met in James Brenner's law office on March 28, 1847. They closed all the curtains, locked the doors. and had a conversation that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "We all have a problem," James said without preamble, "and we all know what that problem is." "My wife wouldn't," Reverend Hayes started, but James cut him off. "Your wife would, mine did, they all did, and it was with the same man." Dr. Thornton leaned forward. "How do you know it's the same man?" "Because I asked my wife, thoroughly, and I've spoken to each of your wives as well, quietly, carefully. They all gave the same name, Tobias, a slave from Cypress Grove Plantation." The room erupted in overlapping voices, demands for proof, denials, threats of violence. It took James 10 minutes to calm them down enough to continue. "Here's what we know," he said, pulling out notes he'd been keeping. "Tobias is approximately 32 years old. He works as a breeding slave, which gives him unusual freedom of movement. He's been coming into town on errands for Edward Harlow for approximately 3 years, and during those 3 years, he's been methodically seducing our wives." "Seducing?" Merchant Dixon's face was purple with rage. "You mean raping?" "No." James's voice was flat. "I wish I could say that. I wish I could say my wife was forced, but she wasn't. None of them were. They went willingly, repeatedly, over months. The silence that followed was suffocating, because if the women had been forced, the men could be victims. Their wives could be victims. Society would rally around them. They could prosecute the slave, execute him publicly, and restore their honour. But if the women went willingly, that was different. That meant their wives had chosen a black slave over them. That meant every man in the county would know they'd been cuckolded by someone society considered less than human. That meant they were jokes, failures, objects of pity and ridicule. "We can't let this become public," Dr. Thornton said finally. "If people know, everyone will know the moment these babies are born." James interrupted. "My daughter is clearly mixed. Yours will be too, all of them." "So we kill him," Dixon said, quietly. "An accident, problem solved." "That doesn't solve the problem of the children," Reverend Hayes said quietly, "or what people will say when they see them." "We could claim illness," Thornton suggested. "Say the children were born with deformities, unfortunately died, tragic but natural." 5 babies dying right after birth. James shook his head. People would ask questions. They argued for 2 more hours, going in circles, finding no solution that didn't end in complete social destruction. Finally, James made a decision. "We go to Edward Harlow," he said. "We tell him what his slave has done. We explain that this needs to be handled discreetly. We let him deal with Tobias in a way that doesn't involve public trials or testimony. And we..." He paused, hating what he was about to say. "We keep the children, claim them as ours, deal with the shame privately rather than publicly." It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan that didn't guarantee their complete ruin. 3 days later, all 5 men rode out to Cypress Grove Plantation. Edward Harlow received them in his study, confused about why so many prominent men had come unannounced. He offered them whiskey, made small talk. Then James Brenner cut to the point. "One of your slaves has been involved with some town women. We need him dealt with discreetly." Harlow's expression went from confusion to concern. "Which slave? What kind of involvement?" "The breeding slave, Tobias. He's been intimate with our wives." Harlow's face drained of colour. Not because he was shocked that Tobias might have violated social boundaries, but because if Tobias had been with town women, what else might he have done? "That's impossible," Harlow said automatically. "Tobias is loyal. He's obedient. He only breeds the women here as I've instructed." "He wouldn't." "Our wives have confessed," Reverend Hayes interrupted. "Multiple women, all saying the same name, Tobias." "How many women?" 5, possibly more." Harlow stood up, went to the window, looked out at his plantation. His mind was racing, because if Tobias had that much freedom, that much access to white women, then no, it couldn't be. Margaret's pregnancy? That was his. It had to be. And Virginia's assault? That had been some random field slave, not Tobias. Tobias was his most trusted slave, his... But even as he thought it, doubt crept in, because Tobias had changed over the past year. Subtle things, a look in his eyes sometimes, a set to his jaw. Small moments where Harlow had felt like he was being observed rather than serving. "I need to speak with him," Harlow said quietly. "Tonight. Alone. Then I'll handle it." The men agreed and left. As they rode away, none of them noticed Tobias watching from the barn. None of them saw the smile on his face, because everything was unfolding exactly as he'd planned. That night, Harlow confronted Tobias in his quarters. "Have you been with white women in town?" Tobias looked up calmly. "Yes, sir." The honesty shocked Harlow. "What? You admit it?" You asked me a question, sir. I'm answering honestly. How many? 5 town women, your wife, your daughter, and 6 slaves here, 13 total. The room tilted. Harlow grabbed the wall for support. My wife? My daughter. Yes, sir. Margaret is 6 months along. Virginia is 7 months. The child Margaret carries isn't yours, neither is Virginia's. Harlow's mind couldn't process it. You're lying. My wife would never. She would. She did. They all did, willingly. I'll kill you. Harlow's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, sir. I expect you will. But first you should know why I did it. And that's when Tobias told him. Everything. About Naomi Turner, Ruth Turner, Joseph Turner, about the free black family that Harlow had kidnapped in August 1828, about the 3 days in the seasoning house, about watching his mother die and his sister fade away, about remembering every single detail for 19 years. You took everything from me, Tobias said quietly. So I took everything from you. Your wife's fidelity, your daughter's purity, your bloodline, the thing you value most in this world, your precious white lineage, is now mixed with the blood of the slave child you created. Every child those women bear will be part of me. Your grandson will be my son. Do you understand? You didn't just lose. Your family tree is now mine. Harlow stood frozen. Then he did what Tobias expected. He screamed for his overseers. They came with chains, with whips. They dragged Tobias to the seasoning house, the same building where his mother had been tortured. They chained him to the wall. And Harlow, for the first time in his life, personally administered a beating. 50 lashes. 100. He lost count. But Tobias didn't scream. He took every blow in silence, because he'd won. The revenge was complete. All that remained was the ending. That night, Tobias broke his chains. It wasn't strength. He'd been working them loose for months, preparing. He walked out of the seasoning house at midnight on November 16th, 1847. He went first to Margaret Harlow's bedroom. She woke to find him standing over her. I need you to understand something, he whispered. Every word I said to you was a lie. I never cared about you. I used you. You were a tool to destroy your husband. Margaret stared at him, tears forming. Why are you telling me this? Because tomorrow, everything ends, and you need to know the truth before it does. He repeated this with each woman. Virginia, the 5 town women who'd been brought to the plantation for safety when their conditions became known. One by one he woke them. One by one he told them the truth. Some cried, some raged, but Tobias had counted on something important. These women were now bonded by shared shame. Society would destroy them if the truth came out. They needed Tobias's silence as much as he'd needed their bodies. Tomorrow morning, he told them, you'll have a choice. Condemn me and destroy yourselves in the process, or protect me and keep your secrets safe. Then came the final act. Tobias went to the main house. Harlow was in his study, drunk, crying, his world shattered. Tobias entered silently. What happened next took 3 hours. But why did Tobias do what he did that night? Why not just escape? He'd gotten his revenge. He'd destroyed Harlow's bloodline. He'd won. So why did he stay? Why did he perform that horrific display in the garden that November morning? The answer lies in what Tobias had learned about justice. Real justice. Not the justice of courts and laws, but the justice of making someone truly understand what they'd done. And for that, Harlow needed to experience exactly what he'd inflicted on others. What Tobias did to Edward Harlow that night was methodical, surgical. Not driven by rage, but by a cold, calculated desire for symmetry. First, he removed Harlow's hands, not quickly, slowly, with a saw from the tool shed, because Harlow had used his hands to sign the false documents that made Tobias and his family slaves. Those hands had struck his mother. Those hands had destroyed lives. Harlow screamed until his voice gave out. Tobias waited for him to regain consciousness before continuing. You told my mother she wasn't free anymore, Tobias said quietly, working. You told her the paper said she was property, so she was property. Do you remember that? Harlow couldn't speak, just nodded frantically. I thought about what you said for 19 years. The paper makes it real, the law makes it true, and I realized you were right. Power creates truth, so tonight I'm creating a new truth. Then he took Harlow's eyes. Because Harlow had watched his mother suffer and found pleasure in it. Tobias used a knife, carefully ensuring Harlow remained conscious. You watched her die, Tobias whispered. Now you can't watch anything anymore. By dawn, Harlow was alive but destroyed, permanently mutilated. Tobias left him on the front steps where everyone would see him. Then came the women. Tobias went to each of the 13 pregnant women. He had a choice to make. Kill them, That would make him the monster everyone already believed him to be. Let them go? They would testify against him, even at the cost of their own reputations. So he did something else. He performed amateur surgery on each woman. He cut their bellies open in vertical slashes, replicating the markings used on plantation ledgers to denote property. He removed each baby, placed them on the ground, each child dead or dying, but he kept the women alive, conscious. And then he cut out their tongues, not to be cruel, to be symbolic. You used your voices to lie, he told each one, to say you cared when you didn't, to make promises you never meant, to tell me I mattered when I was just a tool. So now you have no voice. Just like my mother had no voice, just like every slave who ever tried to speak truth to power. Finally, he stitched their mouths shut with rough thread, leaving them able to breathe, but unable to speak. The garden display at dawn was deliberate. 13 women lined up, 13 dead babies, one mutilated plantation owner, all arranged like a grotesque tableau. When the townspeople arrived at 7 a.m., summoned by a field slave who'd discovered the scene, what they saw broke something fundamental in their understanding of the world. This wasn't random violence. This was a statement. Sheriff McKinley drew his gun immediately, aimed at Tobias, who stood calmly in the centre of it all. "You're under arrest for..." "For what?" Tobias interrupted. "Murder? These women are alive. Assault? Of my own property? Mr. Harlow gave me permission to breed slaves. I was just following orders. You killed the babies. You mutilated. The babies were mine. I can do with my property as I wish. Isn't that the law? And these women," he gestured to them, "are marked as property now. The law you've built says I can do this." The crowd was stunned into silence because Tobias was using their own logic against them. Then Margaret Harlow stepped forward, belly opened, tongue removed, mouth stitched. But she positioned herself between Tobias and the sheriff. Virginia joined her, then Elizabeth, then 3 more of the white women. Sheriff McKinley stared in disbelief. "These women are protecting you? After what you did?" One of the women, Caroline, the schoolteacher, had managed to partially remove the stitches. Through a blood-filled mouth, she spoke garbled words. "He's right. We chose. We all chose." This was the final piece of Tobias's revenge. Not just destroying Harlow's bloodline, not just the physical violence, but forcing these women to confront their own complicity. They had all willingly participated in their own destruction. And now they had to either admit that publicly and face total social annihilation, or protect the man who'd used them. Most chose protection, because admitting the truth would destroy their families, their reputations, their lives. Better to be seen as victims of a slave's madness than as willing participants in their own shame. The town faced an impossible situation. They couldn't arrest Tobias without a full trial. A trial meant testimony. Testimony meant these women explaining in public exactly what had happened. Their husbands, their families, their church, all would know the truth. The town chose silence. They took Tobias into custody, yes, but quietly. They treated the women's wounds. They buried the babies in unmarked graves, and they agreed collectively to never speak of it again. Edward Harlow was sent to an asylum, blind and handless, where he died 3 years later. The plantation was sold. The slaves were dispersed to other properties. And Tobias? He was sent to a maximum security work camp in Louisiana, where he died in 1853, officially of fever. Unofficially, the guards beat him to death one night when no witnesses were present. But Tobias achieved something remarkable. He'd proven that the system of slavery contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, that the logic used to justify owning people could be turned against those who wielded it. That power, when given to someone with nothing left to lose, becomes a weapon that cuts both ways. The story of Tobias and Cypress Grove Plantation was documented in private journals and court records that were later sealed. It wasn't widely known outside of Mississippi Delta communities, where it became a whispered legend, a cautionary tale told to warn against giving slaves too much freedom. But also, in different households, a different moral. Be careful what you destroy in others, for they may one day return that destruction tenfold. What haunts historians who've studied the case isn't just the violence, it's the questions it raises. Did Tobias start with a plan, or did revenge grow gradually over 19 years? Were those 13 women truly willing participants, or had Tobias manipulated them so skillfully that they never had real choice? Was he a monster created by slavery, or would he have been violent regardless? And perhaps most troubling, was what he did justice or merely revenge? Is there a difference when the system itself denies justice to those it oppresses? The documents that remain offer no easy answers. They show a man who was simultaneously victim and victimizer, who suffered unimaginable trauma and inflicted it on others, who used the intelligence that should have made him free to engineer one of the most disturbing acts of revenge in American history. If you've stayed with this dark journey until the end, I want to thank you for bearing witness to this difficult history. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, revenge, and the human capacity for both cruelty and calculation. Hit that subscribe button if you want more hidden histories that challenge our understanding of the past. And leave a comment below. Was Tobias a victim who became a monster, or something more complex? The answer might reveal more about us than about him. What we can say with certainty is this. Edward Harlow destroyed a free black family in 1828 because he could, because the law allowed it, because power made it possible. And 19 years later, Tobias Turner destroyed everything Harlow valued using those same tools. Power, law, the presumption that some lives matter less than others. In the end, Cypress Grove Plantation burned in 1851, 2 years after the events I've described. No one knows who set the fire, no one was ever charged. But local legend says that if you visit the property on November 17th, you can still see marks in the soil where 13 women stood, where 13 babies died, where one man's revenge became a permanent scar on the land itself. The cycle of violence that slavery created didn't end with abolition. It echoed forward through generations. Tobias Turner was one man, one story, but he represented thousands who suffered similar fates, and unlike most, he left a mark so deep that even those who wanted to forget never quite could. So when we ask whether Tobias was justified, whether his revenge was proportional, whether he became the very monster he fought against, these questions miss something fundamental. In a system built on the principle that some humans are property, that some lives are worth less than others, that power creates truth, concepts like justice and revenge lose all meaning. Tobias simply showed the system its own reflection, and it was too terrible to look at directly. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more hidden histories, and remember, the past is never truly past. It lives in the systems we inherit, the stories we tell, and the questions we're brave enough to ask.